Maybe you clicked here out of curiosity. Or maybe, without even realizing it, you were looking for a quiet corner where words arrive slowly and silence has its own place in the conversation. I wrote this story with care, stitching together memories, pain, and the small discoveries that change us. My hope is that somewhere in these moments, you might see a piece of yourself. If that happens, even just for a heartbeat, stay. Listen for as long as you want, and if you feel like it, leave a little trace that you were here. It doesn't have to be much. Sometimes a simple "I'm here" in the comments, or a quiet way of passing the story along, is enough to let us know this space matters. I've painted 100 kitchens in my career. Bright ones, cramped ones, kitchens that smelled of cinnamon or fresh basil. But there's one I can never quite bring myself to capture on canvas. Because if I did, I'd have to hear it again. That sound. Not a scream, not a crash, but the hiss of water right before it becomes steam, the metallic hum of the kettle straining under heat, and then the sharp crack of porcelain hitting tile. I was 7 years old, sitting at a table with my feet barely touching the floor, when the air in that kitchen changed. The sunlight through the window seemed to go cold. My ears rang, my heartbeat climbed into my throat, and my skin prickled as if the heat in the room was crawling toward me. Then came my mother's voice. Not calm, not measured, but a shout I'd never heard from her before. "What is wrong with you?" The words slammed into me harder than the sound of shattering china. I remember the smell of tea, bitter, floral, mixing with something else, something sharper, like metal. I remember my socks being suddenly wet, my toes curling away from a heat that licked at the edges of my skin. And I remember my heart pounding so loudly that I could barely hear the voices above me anymore. It's strange how the body remembers fear even when the mind tries to blur the details. For years, I told myself maybe I had dreamed it, but every time I heard water boil, my stomach clenched and my palms went cold. I was just a little girl, and yet, in that moment, I knew, without understanding why, that something was terribly, unforgivably wrong. It would take me years to realize this memory didn't come from a fire or an accident. It came from a Sunday lunch, in the house where I was supposed to be safest. A casual family gathering, they called it. Back then, if you had asked me who I wanted to grow up to be, I wouldn't have said an artist or a teacher. I would have said, without hesitation, like Aunt Chloe. At 7, I thought she was everything I wasn't. She arrived in clouds of perfume, the kind that clung to your clothes long after she hugged you, if she hugged you. Her hair was never out of place, her nails painted in colors I wasn't allowed to use, and her shoes clicked across the floor like they were announcing her. The adults looked up when she walked in. They didn't look up when I did. She always brought gifts. Glossy shopping bags with tissue paper spilling out like silk. A scarf for Grandma, a bottle of wine for Grandpa, a glittery bracelet for me, even if she'd wrinkle her nose and say, "Don't get it dirty, kiddo." I told myself it was her way of being funny. The truth is, I mistook showmanship for kindness. I didn't see the way her compliments to my mother always carried a tiny hook. "Oh, Rachel, I love that dress. I had one like it in college." Or, "Your cookies are great, but have you tried following an actual recipe?" Still, Chloe was untouchable. She always won arguments, even the ones no one else seemed to be having. If she didn't like a plan, the plan changed. If she told a story, hers was the version that stuck. It was like she lived in a world where she was always right, and the rest of us just circled around her, nodding. I clung to that image, the glamorous, confident woman who got whatever she wanted. until the day I saw her face change. It happened in the same kitchen I told you about before. The same day the kettle screamed. One moment, Chloe was brushing imaginary lint from her sleeve. The next, her eyes snapped to mine. They weren't warm anymore. They were sharp, narrowed, glittering with something I didn't recognize but instantly feared. Her voice cut through the air like broken glass. "You little brat!" I didn't know what I had done. I just knew the perfect aunt in my mind had vanished. And in her place stood someone who could make a child feel small enough to disappear. The cardigan was my favorite, a soft yellow one with little buttons shaped like daisies. Mom had helped me put it on that morning, smoothing the sleeves as if doing so could smooth away the nerves in my chest. We'd baked cookies together, arranging them neatly on a tray wrapped in foil. I'd imagined the smile Grandma would give me when she saw them. The kitchen smelled like roast chicken and polished wood. Grandma stood by the counter, slicing bread, her eyes darting between the food and Chloe, who was recounting some glamorous trip she'd taken. Mom sat beside me, quiet, her hands folded on her lap. Every now and then, I caught her glancing toward me, the kind of look that says, "Just stay still. Just get through it." I reached for the cookie tray, eager to offer one, but in that small reach, my elbow brushed something warm. The teacup tipped. A splash of amber liquid spread across the white tablecloth, dripping toward the floor. The sound Chloe made wasn't words at first. It was a sharp, startled gasp, followed by the scrape of her chair against tile. Her hand shot out, inspecting the damp edge of her cashmere sleeve, and then her voice, cold and cutting. "You little brat." I froze. Mom's chair creaked as she started to move, but Chloe was already turning away from the table. Her heels clicked hard against the floor. She reached the counter where the kettle sat, steam still curling from its spout. Before I could understand what was happening, she lifted it, spun, and, with a motion that seemed almost deliberate, flung the boiling water toward the ground near my feet. The hiss as it hit the tile was louder than I'd imagined boiling water could sound. Heat radiated upward, brushing the tops of my socks. My toes curled away instinctively, cold from the wet fabric clinging to them, while my chest burned with a fear I'd never felt before. I could hear my heartbeat in my ears. The kitchen, the table, the adults, all of it blurred except for the sheen of water on the floor and the sharp scent of oversteeped tea. Mom was beside me in an instant, pulling me back, checking my legs, her hands trembling just enough for me to notice. I heard her voice, low, furious, asking, "What is wrong with you?" But the answer came from somewhere else. "She didn't hit her, Rachel," Grandma's voice said, clipped but calm. "She's just passionate." Passionate. That was the first time I learned a word could be used like a shield, not to protect the hurt, but the one who caused it, and that in our family, it was the shield that mattered most. Mom didn't shout. She didn't throw accusations or demand apologies. Her arm just tightened around me, pulling me in close so my cheek pressed against the steady thump of her heartbeat. I remember the scrape of my chair as she stood, the soft jingle of my cardigan buttons against her coat. I half expected her to tell me to say sorry again, even though I hadn't meant to do anything wrong. But she didn't. She walked us to the door with the same calm you might use leaving a friend's house after coffee, except her grip on me never loosened. At the threshold, she paused, glanced back toward the table where Chloe was refilling her tea, where Grandma was dabbing at the tablecloth as if the stain were the only mess that mattered. "Thank you for lunch," Mom said. Her voice was even. Too even. As a child, I thought that evenness meant surrender. I thought she was too tired to fight, too used to losing. In my mind, silence meant weakness. It meant letting them win. It wasn't until years later, when I was old enough to see how carefully she measured her words, that I understood. That silence wasn't weakness. It was a pause before a strike. The space where she gathered every piece she needed, every scrap of proof, every ounce of control. As we walked to the car, I remember her opening the door for me, tucking the hem of my cardigan in so it wouldn't catch. I looked up at her, waiting for her to tell me everything was fine. She didn't. Instead, she looked back at the house. Her gaze wasn't wistful. It wasn't sad. It was sharp, assessing, like an artist studying a canvas she was about to paint over. When she finally turned away, I knew, even if I couldn't explain it then, that we weren't coming back. The weeks after that lunch blurred together, but my nights stayed sharp. I'd wake in the dark, breathless, heart racing, convinced I'd hear the hiss of water pouring onto tile. Sometimes it was just the hum of the refrigerator or the groan of the pipes. But to me, it was always the kettle. I started crying in my sleep. Mom told me I would mumble things. "Don't yell at me." I didn't mean to. Words I didn't remember saying when morning came. I stopped wearing socks to bed because the damp, clingy feeling from that day haunted me like a second skin. Then Mom began taking me to see a woman named Dana. Her office smelled like crayons and peppermint tea, with a big wooden table covered in paper and markers. I thought she was just a nice lady who let me draw while she asked questions about my favorite animals or how school was going. Sometimes I painted bright suns and crooked houses. Sometimes, without knowing why, I painted cups tipped over, spilling brown liquid onto the ground. To me, Dana was the drawing doctor. I never understood why Mom always seemed quieter after our visits, or why she would leave carrying a folder tucked under her arm like it was fragile. It wasn't until years later, when I was old enough to request my own medical files, that I pieced it together. Those sessions weren't just for comfort. Every question Dana asked, every note she wrote, every picture I drew became part of a record. A timeline of what happened, seen through a child's eyes. It was more than therapy. It was evidence. Mom hadn't been waiting for them to apologize. She'd been preparing for the day they tried to rewrite the story. It was a Tuesday morning, the kind where nothing feels remarkable until it is. Sunlight striped the kitchen table, catching on the rim of Mom's coffee cup. She was scrolling through her email, absently tapping her fingers against the ceramic. Then she froze. Her hand tightened around the mug so hard I thought it might shatter. When she set it down, her fingers trembled just enough for me to notice. I slid into the chair beside her, curious. Her eyes stayed on the screen, scanning, rereading, as if the words might change if she stared long enough. It was from a law firm. The language was formal, full of phrases I didn't understand at 7, but would never forget once I was old enough to decode them. Petition for guardianship. Concerns of parental instability. Denial of reasonable family access. In plain words, my grandparents and Chloe were trying to take me away. I didn't hear the rest of what Mom read that day, but as an adult, I've gone back to those same sentences. They weren't just accusing her of being mentally unstable. They were accusing her of poisoning me against them, of isolating me. They weren't coming for my safety. They were coming for control. Looking back now, I know exactly what it meant. They didn't just want to take my childhood. They wanted to make me the prize in their victory, a way to prove, to themselves and everyone watching, that they could still win. And then came the part that made my mother's jaw set like stone. The letterhead. the crest at the top of the page, embossed in navy ink. I didn't understand at the time why she stared at it so long, but I do now. The law firm belonged to Chloe's fiancé. It wasn't just legal. It was personal. I used to think my mother kept everything in boxes because she was sentimental. Receipts from grocery stores years past, birthday cards with bent corners, folders so thick the paperclips strained to hold them. It wasn't until much later that I realized those weren't keepsakes. They were ammunition. In one drawer, she had the audio from that Sunday lunch, a muffled recording from her phone pocket where you could still hear the scrape of the chair, Chloe's voice snapping, "You little brat," and the hiss of water hitting tile, the gasp in my own voice. The way Grandma said, "She's just passionate," like that excused everything. In another folder were my therapy notes, every drawing, every observation Dana had written in tidy, clinical language. Child displays anxiety responses to raised voices, startles at mention of tea. Not just stories, evidence. She had screenshots of text messages from Grandma mocking her overly emotional parenting, and emails from Grandpa about how I needed discipline instead of softness. The language was casual, but it was enough to show the pattern. They minimized, she defended, they dismissed. And then there was the file I didn't expect. Old tax documents, investment reports, and legal papers from years before I was born, all with her name still linked to a family financial fund. The kind of paperwork most people would have forgotten existed. She hadn't. It was only as an adult that I understood why. Before I was born, my mother had worked with a nonprofit that helped women escape abusive households. She'd spent years sitting in courtrooms, drafting affidavits, watching judges dismiss cases when the proof wasn't airtight. She knew the law, and she knew the loopholes. She hadn't just been my mother. She'd been my silent bodyguard, already playing a game the rest of them didn't even know had started. When you're a child, revenge isn't a concept you understand. You just notice that the people who scared you start looking smaller. I didn't know why Mom spent so many late nights at the kitchen table, the glow of her laptop painting her face in pale light. Or why she'd slide manila folders into her bag before leaving the house, coming back with nothing in her hands but a faint, satisfied calm. Only years later did I learn the shape of her moves. The family investment fund, the one with her name still on it, wasn't just a relic of old paperwork. It was a key, and she turned it. Every cent she withdrew was hers by law. But those cents added up to something my grandparents were counting on, their eligibility for a spot in the luxury retirement home they'd been bragging about for years. Without the fund, their application didn't just pause, it vanished. Then came Chloe's turn. Mom sent an anonymous email to the skincare brand Chloe represented, attaching the recording from that Sunday. The audio was clear enough. Chloe's voice snapping at a child, the hiss of boiling water hitting the floor. The kind of PR nightmare no brand could spin as passionate. The partnership ended within weeks. One by one, her endorsements dried up. Her social media following, once a steady climb, started slipping backwards. Comments turned from adoration to suspicion. Even as a kid, I noticed the difference. Fewer packages arriving at Grandma's house. Fewer new dresses hanging in Chloe's room. At 7, I didn't understand contracts or financial sabotage, but I understood the look in their eyes when we crossed paths in the street. It wasn't triumph anymore. It was something closer to fear. I couldn't name it then, but I can now. It was the moment the walls they'd built around their power began to crack. And my mother had been the one tapping at the fault lines all along. 3 months later, the kettle was no longer in my nightmares. It was on the stage with me. Not literally, of course. but in every word I had written, in every pause I had practiced alone in my room. The school auditorium smelled faintly of sawdust and crayons. Rows of folding chairs creaked under the weight of parents leaning forward, phone cameras ready. I stood behind the curtain, fingers twisting the hem of my dress, feeling the thump of my heartbeat in my throat. When my name was called, the lights hit me first, warm, almost blinding. I stepped to the microphone, my hands shaking just enough for me to grip the stand tighter. I glanced at the front row. Mom was there, her eyes steady on mine, her hands resting calmly in her lap. It was the kind of look that said, "I see you. You're safe." I took a breath and began. My family said I should be quiet, but quiet felt like drowning. My mom said, "Speak louder." So I did, and the whole world started listening. The room was so still I could hear the rustle of paper in the back row. And then, when I stepped back, the applause came. Sudden, loud, and rising like a wave. Some people were smiling, others were wiping their eyes. Mom's hands were clasped, but her smile was wide, proud, and unshakable. It was then that I saw them. In the shadowed space near the exit, my grandparents stood together. No clapping, no smiles, just watching. They looked older, smaller somehow, as if the room itself had pushed them to the edges. I held their gaze for only a second before I turned back to the stage lights. That was the day I took back my voice. And I knew I'd never give it up again. They didn't lose because we won in court. There was no gavel slam, no dramatic headline declaring victory. They lost because somewhere along the way, they stopped deciding what happened next. Control had always been their currency. Who spoke? Who stayed silent? Who mattered? And the moment Mom took that currency out of their hands, the game was over. By the time I was old enough to see it clearly, Mom and I were no longer just surviving. We were building. Together, we registered the Quiet Flame Project, a center where mothers could find legal help, therapy resources, and a safe place to breathe without fear of being called dramatic for protecting their children. On the day we opened the doors, the air smelled of fresh paint and coffee brewing in the corner. Flyers lined the table, and a circle of chairs waited in the main room. Women began to arrive, some with kids clinging to their legs, some alone, all of them carrying a kind of quiet I recognized. As I stood beside Mom, I thought of the lessons I'd inherited. From them, that silence was survival. From her, that silence could be a weapon. And from my own life, something different. That when the truth needs to be heard, you speak. You speak until the room is listening. We walked into the hall together, Mom carrying a stack of welcome folders, me holding the door for the next woman who stepped in. The hum of voices grew, chairs scraping against the floor, children laughing in the corner. I glanced at Mom. She met my eyes, the faintest smile playing at the edge of her mouth. The same steady look she'd given me on that stage years ago. We didn't need to say anything. We were exactly where we were meant to be. Fade out. Two women, once told to be quiet, stepping into a room full of voices ready to rise. A new cycle, not of control, but of healing.